E, finalmente, então, passamos a palavra ao Dr. William Scheuerman para fazer a sua apresentação e, em seguida, abriremos o debate, ok? Obrigada.
Let me again thank the conference organizers, and I want to thank you all for being here. It's hot in here. It's been a long day. I find this a deeply unsettling topic to discuss. It's as though one has to argue again why rape or murder or war crimes are immoral and should be strictly prohibited. And of course, this discussion has been forced upon us. We have to engage in this discussion, but part of me revolts against it. Maybe you feel the same way. Of course, this is difficult. As you know, in the United States and in many other countries, scholars, lawyers, and political activists have been working hard to criticize the legal and intellectual basis for the Bush administration's embrace on torture. And you've heard, of course, from a number of the most eloquent critics of the Bush administration last night as well as this morning. If I'm not mistaken, however, at least one of the administration's main arguments, I think, remains pretty much unanswered by those of us, and as you already can tell, I would immediately place myself in this camp, opposed to and indeed deeply shocked by what the Bush administration has been arguing. According to my government in Washington, the war on terror constitutes an example of the new paradigm of warfare. This is a term President Bush used in a memo from 2002. This new kind of warfare, the term has come up again and again in administration memos, also in public documents, allegedly renders many of the traditional rules of war, including the strict prohibition on torture, obsolete. That's the word that was chosen by Attorney General Alberto Gonzales in another memo, which was secret, but eventually became public information, memos from 2002. The new warfare the Bush administration tells us is characterized by a number of attributes. It's undertaken by irregular, non-state actors who wear neither uniforms nor other identifying insignia, and for those of you who know something about international law, this is not without significance. They operate via dispersed organizational networks rather than by means of traditional bureaucratically organized military organizations. Its practitioners often, not always, but often ignore the Geneva Conventions. They oftentimes engage in terrible acts of brutality. And last, but by no means least, we've been told in the United States, they seek control over weapons of mass destruction. They thus pose nothing less than a catastrophic threat to civilized nations. This is the language the Bush administration actually has used everywhere. Since allegedly the Geneva Conventions did not properly consider this new type of warfare, and because, again, it supposedly represents nothing less than an existential threat to our way of life, there is now no principled reason, this is how the argument goes, why the U.S. and its allies should tie their hands to historically anachronistic prohibitions on severe interrogation. Dick Cheney, I think, has stated, he's not a particularly articulate man, but he is a blunt man, and he has said this, I think, quite clearly. Our enemies would stop at nothing to destroy us, so why should we stop at nothing to keep them from doing so? So at least one of the main arguments made by the Bush administration is an empirical, and frankly, it's an historical one. The nature of warfare is undergoing dramatic changes, and because this new warfare represents a kind of barbarism, the U.S. can no longer blindly follow humanitarian norms which may have been well suited to a previous period in military history but no longer are. A second claim, and I think this is a little bit less obvious, but I think if you look at these memos, it's there. A second claim then concerns the proper relationship between law and changing political and military realities. When international law no longer conforms to the empirical realities of violent conflict, it's potentially out of date and has to be altered, maybe even just abrogated. And this is something the Bush administration, I think, is arguing. So what I want to do today is try to respond to these two closely interlinked claims, and you'll see very quickly my presentation, it's a political one. I'm not going to go into some of the deep philosophical questions. These are political arguments being made by the administration. I want to do so by means of two basic steps. I want to show, first of all, that the argument rests on a simplistic account of the history of modern warfare and a crude and, I'm going to suggest, cynical view of what law is supposed to be. And then, in a somewhat more complicated and, I hope, intellectually a bit more nuanced second step, I want to try to concede cautiously that the administration is onto something. Warfare indeed is changing. It's not changing as dramatically as they like to claim, and that we have to think through what this might mean. Nonetheless, my government in Washington is drawing all the wrong conclusions from these changes, while conveniently ignoring U.S. complicity in some of the worst of the changes that are taking place. All right, so the first part of the argument. What's wrong with the Bush administration's position on the so-called new warfare? Well, I think there are two immediate problems. First, it badly exaggerates the novelty of contemporary terrorism. Irregular warfare, undertaken either by guerrillas or terrorists, and of course we can have a discussion about how one might delineate these two phenomena from each other. That's something we can argue about. In any event, irregular warfare has made up a surprisingly ubiquitous feature of modern warfare. I think this is something we tend to forget. Irregular armed movements have long lurked in the periphery of the modern state system. They have repeatedly stepped out of its shadows to remind developed political and military organizations of the strategic advantages of what some scholars call poor man's warfare. And to some extent, that's what irregular warfare is. It's engaged in by actors who lack the awesome political, economic, and military resources that can be mobilized by states. It's used by actors who are clearly at a competitive disadvantage, even if, as in the case of bin Laden, they are personally wealthy. Even Napoleon, it turns out, I was surprised to read this recently, was forced to wage battle with non-uniform combatants in the backwoods of Spain. Their favorite weapon, if I understand correctly, was something like a modern pitchfork. In the United States, pro- and anti-slavery groups waged a bloody guerrilla war on the Kansas-Missouri border in the 1850s. Countless anti-colonial movements, of course, including, to some extent at least, the American Revolution, have relied on elements of irregular warfare. These movements have depended on organizational structures out of sync with conventional state-based military models, typically conforming to a more or less Weberian conception of bureaucratic organization. They've often showed real disdain for the conventional rules of war, including the crucial distinction between combatants and non-combatants. You can read how vexed Napoleon was by the barbarian Spaniards who ignored this. Movements widely described as terrorist in character have now arguably been around for well over a century. If you look at the scholarship on terrorism, one tendency is to date it to 19th century Russia, trace it to 19th century Russia. So for at least a century, terrorist movements have included at least some of the elements the Bush administration now describes as constitutive of the new paradigm of warfare. Now, as I suspect at least some of you are aware, there's also a research literature on what's called the new terrorism. Some of which seems to speak directly to President Bush's claims. I mean, has something happened in terrorism over the last couple of decades such that we can speak of some sort of qualitative change? That's the question. It seems to me, however, if you look at this scholarly literature, it doesn't provide the support for the Bush administration that I think its disciples would like to find there. On the contrary, much of this literature tends to emphasize the continuities between organizations like Al-Qaeda and previous terrorist organizations. Al-Qaeda is by no means the first terrorist organization, for example, to take on distinctly religious traits. If you look at the National Security Council statements, there's a lot of talk about its quasi-totalitarian religious nature. And I'm not quite sure what is meant by that, but I don't think this is new. Nor, of course, is Al-Qaeda the first organization that relies on what basically are cross-border non-state networks. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, much of the administration's rhetoric focuses on the perils of weapons of mass destruction falling into the hands of terrorists. According to this line of argumentation, the specter of a catastrophic attack, the much-discussed possibility of a dirty bomb in a New York City subway, for example, looms large in attempts to separate the new warfare from the old. And I think especially this facet of the so-called new paradigm has been important in legitimizing what Vice President Dick Cheney likes to describe, not simply, I don't think he actually says torture light, he actually says alternative interrogation techniques. So the language is actually even worse than what Jessica was talking about. Yet here as well, skepticism is in order. Al-Qaeda's attack on the World Trade Center obviously hardly depended on high-tech weapons of mass destruction. A favorite technique, according to the literature, among contemporary terrorists is the deadly, the horrible, but technologically pretty simple suicide bomb. Arguably, the only case of terrorists successfully employing weapons of mass destruction was the terrible 1995 sarin gas attack in the Tokyo subways. Yes, of course, observers have recorded other attempts by terrorists to gain access to weapons of mass destruction. We shouldn't trivialize this possibility. Yet it remains, by, I think, any serious systematic account, premature to declare that modern warfare has thereby undergone some sort of revolutionary transformation. So where then is the historical novelty in the war on terror as it's being conducted by the United States? If irregular warfare is more commonplace in modern history than the Bush administration claims, what's so different about the present situation? Well, I think for better or worse, this takes us directly to the legal arguments that are made by the administration. I think at least in the U.S. context, they are novel. They are not novel in the global context. Many of these arguments, unfortunately, were made, for example, by the French in Algeria. A lot of interesting similarities. Also, frankly, there's a wonderful piece by Scott Horton on this, by the Nazis when they dealt with the Red Army. But in the U.S. context, I think there is a novelty here. And where is the novelty? Well, it's in this cynical interpretation of law that I think the administration is defending. Implicit in the Bush administration discourse on the new paradigm of warfare is the seemingly commonsensical but deeply misleading intuition that the laws of warfare somehow need to mesh directly with the empirical realities of violent conflict. I mean, I really do think this is what's being claimed. In this view, the facts or realities of warfare have changed, right? Therefore, law has to be remade to conform to those realities. According to the crudest version of the argument, again, I think Dick Cheney has made this quite bluntly, contemporary terrorist organizations no longer respect the laws of war. Why should we? The once secret administration memos condoning torture by Gonzalez, you, Bybee, and others typically start, at least in my reading of them, with a simple juxtaposition of the empirical facts of war to the legal and normative structure of law, before then rapidly proceeding to note, oftentimes with some justification, it seems to me, the existence of discontinuities between facts and norms of warfare. Administration apologists then crudely deduce that existing norms should be abandoned or at least fundamentally altered. Now, if you think about this intellectual strategy for a bit, it is dubious, to put it politely. In reality, as I try to suggest, I'd be happy to talk more about why this is the case, there has always at least been some tension between the modern rules of civilized warfare and the facts of warfare on the ground. Guerrilla warfare and terrorism have not only been relatively commonplace, but even, of course, in the context of classical interstate warfare, what the literature refers to as Clausewitzian warfare, humanitarian laws of war have obviously suffered many violations. Of course, they did on both sides in World War II, for example. In other words, some gap between law as a structure of norms and the empirical realities of warfare is probably unavoidable, at least to some extent, and I think that's at least what the historical record strongly suggests. Now, if you take this a step further and think about it, it probably should not surprise us. Law, after all, is not supposed to perfectly capture or contain the actual empirical regularities of human action. It's supposed to funnel those regularities in some direction which we consider desirable, right? To put the point crudely, law tells us what we ought to do. In contrast to private morality, in contrast to custom, mores, it also uses particular devices to sanction those who violate what we think we should be expected to do. So traffic rules, to take a trivial example, do not in fact accurately describe how most of us drive, and based on what I've seen so far in your beautiful country, this is even more true here than it is where I presently live in the American Midwest. Though these rules, nonetheless, right, are still supposed to encourage and normalize driving habits so that we follow them, or at least something approaching them. I don't claim to do more than that, frankly, most of the time. The mere fact that many of us occasionally ignore, or as I like to tell the sheriff when I'm pulled over for speeding, creatively interpret traffic rules hardly demonstrates their obsolete character. As a normative system, law always stands in some tension to empirical reality. That's in part why it's law to begin with. And this doesn't mean that it's irrelevant. Now, of course, any effective system of law, domestically, internationally, it seems to me, of course, there are important differences there we could talk about. As the legal theorist, I think Lon Fuller put it most nicely, most effectively, 1964, The Morality of Law, a wonderful little book. It should not require the impossible. This is what Fuller said from us. So if law is too far out of sync with human behavior or basic human preferences, it's not going to enjoy general compliance. And of course, sometimes a new social or technological innovation fundamentally challenges the legal status quo. So for example, if you look at the introduction of automobiles, my understanding at least is that some of the traffic rules that were designed for the era of the horse and buggy indeed became anachronistic, or they had to be dramatically modified. Now, in fairness to the Bush administration, this is probably the type of scenario they have in mind when they claim that recent changes in warfare require getting rid of obsolete rules. Yet if in fact the administration in Washington believes that regular compliance with the Geneva Conventions, with various prohibitions on torture, is somehow obsolete, it must also, it seems to me, at least implicitly posit or believe that the dominant U.S. approach to the laws of warfare has been anachronistic for many, many decades. After all, some gap, as I've tried to say, between the norms and facts of international politics seems to be relatively long-standing in character, if not necessary. It's not sudden or novel that we have this problem. Now, not surprisingly, the administration has refused to make a claim as deeply and counterintuitive as this one. And if you think about this, I think it's easy to see why. It would seem very hard-pressed to explain the United States' dramatic rise to global preeminence over the course of the last century. During this period, of course, the U.S. has generally, although by no means always, unfortunately, right, respected the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions. Now, if these conventions have somehow been obsolete, and that has to be the implication, one, I think, would have a hard time explaining how the United States became the world's dominant military power. It just doesn't make sense. I don't know if Dick Cheney has thought things through to that stage, but there's an illogical implication here. The administration also conveniently fails to mention that international law has in fact already been at least partially adapted to some of the realities of present-day irregular warfare. And my colleagues who are international lawyers can fill you in on that better than I can. I'll remind you of a couple of things. Although unsigned by the U.S. Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention from 1977 extended some protections enjoyed by regular troops to certain guerrillas, major UN conventions agreed to since 1970 prohibit hijacking, attacks on government officials, the taking of hostages and terrorist bombings, quote unquote, of another country's facilities. So arguably international law has in fact responded with relative alacrity to many of the phenomenon which violently grabbed the attention of so many of us on that terrible day of September 11th, 2001. It's simply incorrect, in other words, to assert, as Mr. Gonzalez did, that core elements of present-day irregular warfare, he said, have not been contemplated by international law. Now, of course, the enforcement of much of this law leaves something to be desired, but the United States itself, of course, unfortunately, is at least partly, and I think in some cases significantly to blame for this lack of compliance. All right, let me move to the second part of my talk. Now, if this is all there were to say, I'm not sure this would be all that interesting intellectually, because what I've basically done is offered a political rebuttal to arguments made by the administration, which I think are extremely influential, very important for popular discourse in the U.S., but intellectually maybe aren't all that powerful. Here's the catch. The situation at hand is more complicated than I have described to you so far, so I've engaged in a bit of a sleight of hand here for rhetorical purposes. Contemporary warfare is undergoing some changes, and I think those changes do raise some tough questions, even for those of us who are shocked by what's been going on. If you go back, or if you go and you look at the recent literature on contemporary warfare, and there's lots of this stuff out there, and I'll just tell you that, you'll find something like the following argument. According to the British scholar and former peace activist Mary Calder, some of you may know her work, it's very important, Someone who's less well known in the English-speaking world, perhaps in Brazil. I know you have deep intellectual ties to the European continent. The German political theorist Herfried Münkler, as well as many, many others, none of whom by any means are intellectual allies of the Bush administration. There is substantial evidence for the empirical claim that classical interstate wars have indeed been declining. I mean, you can count this. There are fewer of them as a proportion of violent conflicts. A growing number of wars are undertaken by militias, paramilitary units, private mercenaries, criminals, etc. In some parts of the world, the state appears to be surrendering its monopoly on legitimate violence. Its most basic function, as Thomas Hobbes taught us, the guarantee of basic security, seems to be undergoing some sort of process of privatization. It takes many different forms, but this also, it seems to me, seems to be relatively commonplace. Now, according to this body of literature, which indeed overlaps a little bit with what the Bush administration has been saying, we are experiencing a proliferation of irregular combatants. They wage war in a decentralized and fragmentary manner. They employ light but horribly destructive weapons, and they operate across borders. They're tied in all sorts of ways to processes which we typically now place under this rubric of globalization. Although typically emerging on the periphery of the state system where military and political organizations are relatively fragile, this form of warfare, Mary Calder speaks of the new wars, has impacted significant parts of the world, the Balkans, Central Asia, the Middle East, parts of Africa. Such warfare is characterized by mind-boggling atrocities, random killing, mass rapes, looting, mass population displacement. In Rwanda, according to some reliable accounts, as many as 8 million women were raped. As Calder and I think others have correctly emphasized, present-day irregulars do indeed tend to discard the laws of war. The breakdown of the combatant-non-combatant distinction that arguably has been foreshadowed by earlier varieties of irregular warfare and also, frankly, by the experience of total war seems to be fully attained, one might say, when, as in Yugoslavia or Rwanda, war crimes become ubiquitous, commonplace. Now, what does this mean for the argument that I'm trying to develop against my government? Well, the first thing I think that needs to be said is that there's an occasional tendency in this literature, as in the Bush administration rhetoric, to offer a somewhat one-dimensional portrayal of present-day trends. There's sometimes an implicit nostalgia here for a golden age of classical interstate warfare, which somehow is now being fully jettisoned for an altogether new form of war, as though one can see the one paradigm neatly replacing the other paradigm. However, the empirical trends are more complicated than even the most sophisticated theorists of the new or contemporary warfare, I think, want to recognize. Historical development, you will not be surprised to hear, does not accord neatly with the ideal, typical conceptions developed by scholars. There are many sound empirical reasons, which we also could talk about, for expecting that conventional interstate warfare, for better or for worse, obviously, is going to remain a significant part of the international scene. So let me just flesh this out a bit. I mean, for example, Calder and other people, I think they downplay the extent, a lot of people have made these criticisms of this literature. I'm simply summarizing here. There's no originality. She tends to downplay the extent to which armed banditry and terrible crimes were also constitutive of earlier forms of warfare, quite commonplace, actually, in civil and revolutionary wars. Yes, the new warfare is now taking a cross-border form. It's globalized in some ways, but it often remains tied closely to traditional disputes about territory. Even Al-Qaeda, for example, was motivated, at least in part, by an attempt to get the U.S. military out of Saudi Arabia. The widely asserted claim that in this genre the state is losing its monopoly on violence is also overstated. The new wars seem to occur where state and military structures have been, frankly, for a long time, weak and artificial. I mean, it doesn't make sense to speak of a decline in statehood where its basic attributes never fully emerged. More importantly, it seems to me, even if the empirical story is more complicated than I suggested, it is more complicated. And even if the Bush administration is justified in worrying about the growth of irregular warfare, and it is justified, I think, about that, there remains no legitimate reason that I can fathom for the U.S. to abandon humanitarian rules on interrogation, at the risk of stating the obvious. And this is what happens, I think, when outrageous claims such as torture can be legitimate. I mean, in a way, when I feel as though I end up restating the obvious. Our surrender of these rules, the U.S.'s surrender of these rules is not going to encourage, as we've been seeing, the Taliban or Al-Qaeda to reverse course and embrace them. On the contrary, what's happened, and I think it could have been predicted, was predicted in Iraq and elsewhere, is it's been taken as further evidence for the fundamental brutality of U.S. policy. Throughout recent history, terrorist movements have counted on an overreaction from liberal states as a way of undermining the legitimacy of those states. This is what happened to the French in Algeria, many other examples. The U.S., like so many other liberal states, has, again, fallen into this familiar trap. It's as though nothing has been learned historically. Having said that, it does remain probable, I think, that the U.S. and other developed countries will, in fact, increasingly find themselves challenged by irregular forces. I do think this is a conclusion one can draw from the scholarly literature which I'm talking about. Quite likely in the U.S. and elsewhere as well, perhaps, domestic political pressures are going to grow in favor of this mean-spirited view of international law that I was talking about, the view that I think Dick Cheney has stated most bluntly. Yet I think this simply underscores the urgency of strengthening and, when necessary, reforming international law and what President Bush himself has described as consistent with the principles of Geneva. Obviously, we can have legitimate disagreements about which reforms are desirable. Obstacles to reform remain sizable. They don't, unfortunately, simply come from the United States. Russia and China are also not keen on some of these reforms that are being talked about. But to infer, as the Bush administration has, that giving up the prohibition on torture, I mean, this is the argument I think that's being made, denying humane treatment to accused terrorists can be plausibly described as a constructive reform consonant with the spirit of Geneva, at best represents the deepest possible misunderstanding of the laws of war, and at worst, the height of cynicism. The Bush administration may claim, I think President Bush he actually believes this, based on these memos I've seen, that we're updating or somehow reforming the laws of war. In reality, of course, we're dismantling some of the great humanitarian achievements of the last half century for the sake of bringing about a dangerous synchronization of law with the ugliest facets of contemporary warfare. Obviously, that's not what legal reform is supposed to be about. Last point here. Nonetheless, it seems to me that even the most admirable attempts to strengthen international law, as it concerns irregular organizations like Al-Qaeda, are only the tip of the iceberg. President Bush has also declared that the new paradigm of warfare was, this is a quote, ushered in not by us but by the terrorists, end of quote. According to this view, if it's now necessary for the United States to stop complying with some of these rules, and Mr. Bush clearly thinks that it is, this unfortunate decision has been tragically forced upon the United States by facts not of our own making. Now, at first glance, this may seem plausible, given the terrible things that happened on September 11th. At closer examination, of course, it's a terribly one-sided and indeed misleading claim, which I think one has to respond to. As a superpower, the United States, of course, has played a significant role in shaping international politics and law for, a century or so. The U.S. can hardly claim to have been an innocent bystander as irregular warfare, and indeed especially brutal forms of irregular warfare, have proliferated. As many have pointed out, and this was alluded to, I thought, in the discussion this morning, some of the most terrible attributes of recent warfare emerged out of what Calder aptly dubs the dark underbelly of the Cold War. Now, the empirical story here is incredibly complicated, and so what I'm going to have to do is crudely summarize the argument. But if you think about some of the most striking aspects of contemporary irregular warfare, I mean, it does build upon some of the worst strategies that were employed in the Cold War. The special weight placed on committing conspicuous atrocities and generalizing complicity in them, making as many people as possible somehow complicit, widespread sexual violence, fomenting violent ethnic discord, the forced resettlement of entire populations. At least some of this can be traced to counterinsurgency and counterterrorism strategies. In order to combat the left, as I'm sure you all know, in Latin and South America, the U.S. schooled a large number of visiting officials in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism techniques at the School of the Americas, which, as far as I understand, still exists. It's gotten a new name, but I think it's still operating. Visitors were trained in the latest methods of irregular warfare. Now, this is also very complicated, but there are some troubling things clearly about this history. For example, before its withdrawal from the curriculum in 1991, there was a public outcry, a brief public outcry. Part of the assigned materials included readings widely, and I've seen some of this quite accurately described as torture manuals. Perpetrators of some of the worst human rights abuses in Latin and South America were at least partly trained by the United States at the expense of American taxpayers. Even if Mr. Bush's frontal assault on the laws of war and the prohibition on torture sets him apart from his predecessors in the White House, I think it does. I think there is a break here. I think he's much more radical on this in a very disturbing way. He is by no means the first U.S. president, obviously, to have determined that it might be useful to, we heard the expression this morning, take the gloves off in the fight against what once were mostly left-wing irregular forces in the developing world. The story here is very complicated. I mean, John F. Kennedy, it turns out, was actually sort of a figure in this. The terrible irony, of course, is that financial aid for and training of mostly right-wing armed irregulars, typically operating in what at best might be described as legal gray zones, has now contributed to changes in warfare which indeed, I think, render the humanitarian laws of war politically precarious. Now, I'm not trying to claim that the United States is exclusively or even chiefly responsible for the ugliest aspects of contemporary warfare. I think that would be, forget the political ramifications, just empirically inaccurate. It's just not right. However, to the extent that a new paradigm of warfare is emerging, it represents clearly, in part, a recipe of the U.S.'s own making. Despite what President Bush has said, the new warfare was not forced upon us by external developments, but in part represents a consequence of U.S. policies. Nowhere, it seems to me, is this more obvious than in Afghanistan, where the U.S., as you know, beginning in 1979, and then with vastly greater enthusiasm and resources under the Reagan administration, provided massive financial support and training to Islamist irregulars doing battle with the Soviets. The U.S. never openly endorsed terror attacks on Afghan civilians, but we repeatedly did condone actions which at the very least straddled the border separating guerrilla warfare from outright terrorism. We helped construct a massive military infrastructure of specialized training camps. We provided sabotage training manuals, advanced weapons, electronic bomb detonators. In 1996, the Clinton administration quite aptly described the results of our policies there as having resulted in a terrorist infrastructure that was now unambiguously anti-U.S. The young bin Laden, I know this, I'm sure this has gotten some news here, it did for a while in the U.S. I mean, it turns out he recruited some of his first jihadist followers from U.S.-funded camps. Instead of rethinking the shady history of U.S. dealings with irregular warfare, with paramilitaries, other irregular forces, the Bush administration irresponsibly and I think tragically used the 9/11 attacks as an opportunity to experiment with some of the worst features of irregular warfare. So while justifying the denial of basic protections to accused terrorists and Talibans who refuse to wear uniforms or other identifying insignia, U.S. special operatives, this was, if I understand correctly, a pet project also of Donald Rumsfeld, they have now taken in a substantial way, if I'm correct, to dressing in civilian clothing. A crucial feature of recent irregular warfare, as I noted, is its reliance on private militias and mercenaries. Well, as finally has been getting some attention in the U.S. because of recent scandals, the Bush administration, as you I'm sure have heard, has employed, depending on how you count, maybe over 100,000 mercenaries in Iraq. A major reason for the administration's embrace of them is that domestic and international laws regulating them are filled with gaps and loopholes. This gives them a relatively free hand in comparison to regular military forces, many of whom, I think understandably and correctly, are angry about what we've been doing there with this, understandably so. Not coincidentally, private contractors were involved with the abuses of Abu Ghraib. The Geneva Conventions, if I understand correctly, do not clearly prohibit all sorts of private contractors, right? There's some difficult issues here. The Uniform Military Code governing regular U.S. troops has not been applied to them, although there's now an attempt to make this happen in the U.S. Private contractors gained immunity from prosecution by the Iraqi government, one of the last things that Mr. Bremer did. The widespread use of private mercenaries has allowed the U.S., in short, to circumvent both domestic and international law. Now, I began my talk by criticizing this crude view that laws somehow should be synchronized in correspondence with the worst features of contemporary warfare. Obviously, however, much more than a different conception of law or even sensible reforms we could talk about are going to be necessary if we are to reestablish the strict prohibition on torture and other humanitarian rules in the U.S. U.S. citizens, I know this is obvious, I'm going to say it nonetheless, U.S. citizens are going to have to push for dramatic changes in foreign policy, and I think ultimately a fundamentally different view of how we relate to the rest of the world. We're going to have to challenge clearly the morally callous and politically self-destructive view that in order to dismantle the so-called new paradigm of warfare, we must join the ranks of its most prominent practitioners. That's a fatal mistake, it seems to me. I want to thank you all for your time. I'm looking forward to your comments and criticisms. Thank you again.